that we have occasion of this. So, hi, and welcome to week 9 of IT64 project management. This is we're going to start with a little bit of a review of our previous materials and then step right into project risk management. So, starting with project quality management. Last time we discussed project quality management, obviously, and in project quality management, the most important thing is to understand that the lack of quality really introduces a large risk into the production process, which is also why quality management really is part of risk management, and risk management really is part of quality management, right? So, quality management starts with plan quality management. You have completed a quality management plan as your last exercise. We put quality assurance. That means we are checking all our processes to make sure that we have followed all of our processes that we have paid for through our good cost of quality. And we're checking our outcome as well. Control quality, of course, means we are checking to see if the number of bugs that we have produced through any kinds of process improvements has gone down or not, right? So, we also talked about quality engines, process quality and product quality. I just talked about that regarding also the requirements adherence and whether something is fit for use. We've talked about all of these. These are in the previous lecture, which if you can't remember anymore what that was about, I encourage you to revisit. Then there is not just the process quality and the product quality that we need to consider, but we also need to consider the quality of you as the project manager. And the product quality is measured through cost performance and schedule performance. That we have cost performance indices and schedule performance indices, or the CPI and the SPI of the project, which of course changes or adjusts itself every single time that we measure, and which should be close to 1. How that is calculated is here again, where we measure the planned performance with the planned value cost. The cost. We can compare the planned values, that planned expenses, the actual cost that we have incurred. And from there, we can also look at the percent complete of the work that we have actually performed. By comparing the plan versus the actuals, we derive our cost performance index, which is what we're seeing here as the process of calculating this, so that we can also calculate what is called our earned value. Our value here is completion times actual percentage complete. That we can see at each point here as our percent complete changes with the progress of the project. Here we can see how much value we've actually received. And remember, projects are measured based on the value they deliver, not on the amount of resources they consume or on the amount of schedule that they consume. So this is where we look at the earned value curve here, and the earned value curve shows us whether we are behind or right. And here we are both, seeing that our earned value is lower than what was planned. The planned value is our blue line, earned value is our gray line, and then we have our actual cost here that is spent. That's a very faint little square here, and we're all over budget, and that is also reflected in our cost performance index here, where we divide the earned value by the actual cost at the time of measurement here, which at this point our CPI is 0.53 for this project. How we got there was reflected in the previous slides. And then our schedule performance index, which is the earned value divided by planned value, because remember, we always want to ensure that we measure the actuals in relation to our plan, right? This is why it's important to plan well and perform well as well, or to perform according to plan. And our schedule performance index here is at 0.67. Both are definitely not stellar, and this is where on a project status report there would be a lot of explaining to do. So now, different ways of measuring quality, and quality has a lot to do with measurements, and believe it or not, project risk has a lot to do with measurements as well, right? And the point always is, as we go into our project risk management knowledge area, which is what I believe really one of the most important areas of project management, because from our management unit, we are going to take with us that you can't manage what you don't measure. That is, you can't manage what you don't know. For risks, that is especially significant. We want to know what the risks are on our project that would prevent us from being successful. We know what is going to prevent us from being successful, and if we manage that which is going to prevent us from being successful, or not even going to, which might prevent us from being successful, then we can be successful. The next thing that to look at then is our risk management process, which is part of our PMBOK 6 that was updated here. In terms of monitoring risks, before that it was called control risks. We plan risk management at the beginning of a project cycle. That means we try to figure out how are we going to attack our risk management process for this project. When are we going to meet? How are we going to track our risks, and so on, right? Remember, again, you cannot manage what you don't know. So it's really important to identify your risks and figure out how bad their impact could be. Also, what the potential is for that impact to arise, right? So you have two components here. You have the impact and you have the probability for risk. And both together, probability and impact measurements, really allow you to quantify your risk. Quantitative categories, see that in a little bit, on a risk matrix that typically has values from 1 through 5 based on whatever taxonomy, which we'll see in a little bit as well. Or you can quantify it in terms of dollars, which is also what we're going to see. Then it is important to plan our risk responses. What kinds of possible risk responses are out there is also something we'll be discussing in a moment. And once you have figured out how much a risk is going to cost should it occur, then we also want to ensure that we can plan our risk responses. That means if you make an implementation plan, just like a mini project plan or a mini project schedule, you assign somebody who's in charge of mitigating a risk or of working it off in whichever other way. And then ensure that the risk responses and their steps are being executed, which means they're going to be implemented, and then you're going to have to monitor them. And believe it or not, risk management is an ongoing process in our project. So it doesn't happen just once. We just we don't just sit down at the beginning of a project and say, well, these are my project risks. Woohoo! Now I know them all. No. Risk management is like stakeholder management, right? There's people all the time that come out of the woodwork that might have an interest in your project. Believe it or not, risk management is the same way, right? New risks that can pop up anytime, that can come out of the woodwork, that can impact the success of your project. And you want to make sure to identify them, manage them. Once you cannot manage what you don't know. So, the risk. Now, we look at risk. A risk is an uncertain event or condition, and this is the PMBOK definition, that can have one or more causes, that can have one or more effects or impacts, unknown or unknown. So in other words, we need to ensure that we know what triggers a risk. We need to figure out what the likelihood is of a risk occurring. We need to understand what the causes are for a risk, and then how bad the impact could be, or how good, right? And we need to determine an appropriate response and then track the response activity, right? So now, as you read over this project risk management slide here, we want to understand also the difference between a risk and a problem. As I said before, likelihood of probability attached to it, which means it can occur, doesn't have to, but you want to be prepared, right? Now, problem has already occurred or will occur with a % of probability, or 99, or higher than 95, whatever the organization has defined as such. So this is where the difference between a risk and a problem becomes apparent. Problems typically are assigned to issue management, which is reactive. It's firefighting mostly, is what is often called in project management. And issue management, problem management stands in contrast to preventive measures, because management can help us prevent risks from impacting the project, right? So problem management or issue management, which is reactive, and you have risk management, which is proactive, right? Now, risk management then, basically this cycle here, the goal is to, it is a positive risk. Remember, I mean, a risk is anything that can change the course of a project, right? There are positive risks that increase the probability and the impact of positive events, and decrease the probability and the impact of events adverse to the project. That's possible, but more often than that, those opportunities, right? We risks that, in fact, negative to our project outcome. So for that, we start with risk planning and risk identification and risk assessment. We determine what our risk strategies, our risk responses are, and then we continue this entire cycle and over throughout the project, right? Typically can impact project objectives in terms of performance, quality, technical parameters, schedule for completion dates, cost or budget, or other objectives, depending on the industry in which you are running your project, right? So risk can be known. We already know that something bad is coming down the pipe, or can be unknown. The issues here, I find, could become an unknown risk, or could become a known risk or a problem, right? Known risks you plan for. Risks you cannot plan for, but in some way, if you know enough about the organization or the history of projects in an organization, you discover that some of the unknown risks that you think are unknown are in fact not that unknown, and they have shown up before. And this is where you can use risks from previous projects to ensure that you keep eyes open to the current project that you're managing, right? In other words, the unknown unknowns really are a very small subset of risks. Most risks are known. You know who to ask. we identify risks? Well, typically, go around your technical team. Always start with the technical team because it's the people who are at the who are where the rubber meets the road, who are at the lowest possible technical level, or to the technical implementation in your project, that will tell you what the risks are. Sometimes upper management will want to weigh in with some business risks or some stakeholder risks, and those are important too. But never forget to ask the people who actually do the real work. And I the hard way, so here's my wisdom that I'm passing on to you. So, yeah, I define risk. Ask people what may keep you from achieving your goal. Then make a list, right? Then if whatever you have on this list here is first, what is it going to look like? How bad is it going to be? And that's your impact right there, right? And then you also want to know, why will the items on your list keep you from achieving your plan and your goal? Because you understand how you can attack that root cause for the risk in order to make that risk go away, weaken the risk, to make it less probable it'll happen, or to weaken the impact, right? So it's the cause that you really want to attack. So when you find that out, how do we know what questions to ask? So organizations often supply you with a risk taxonomy. That is typically the job of the PMO in your organization. If your organization does not have a PMO, then well, you're going to have to work slightly differently. But here's a little risk taxonomy that might help you out. A list of potential sources of risk, in other words, in an organization or on a project, right? So some of these are organizational. In other words, are there any compliance or legal risks? Are there any laws that you don't know about? Are there any new regulations that are being developed as you're running your project, so that you may have to change some of your code or some of your design in order to comply with new regulations that are about to come out, right? Are people not ready? Are your users not ready to accept your new product? That can happen too. Is information that you need available? Do your stakeholders know what to expect, right? So, or are you going to have any problems getting any of your changes and any of your software changes and your design changes approved? You know, organizational complexity can be a real issue, right? And of course, we have technological sources of risk, like security, big one, right? The environment in which you are deploying can be a source of risk, right? And then also we need to understand that design can pose a risk if it is not appropriately scalable or not robust enough, right? So then we have other areas in which we can find risks, which are requirements that are typically, vague or just not doable. Funding, design, people, quality, technology, contractor performance, right? Contractor performance can be a big one. Imagine what would happen if you have outsourced a major part of your project, or you have outsourced the entire testing cycle to a company, and also all of a sudden that contractor company for bankruptcy, right? In fact, that happen. That is never really nice, especially if you don't have a backup plan in place. You're losing time with that, valuable schedule, and valuable budget, of course, as well, right? So note that these categories for this taxonomy that you're seeing here really change with the organization and with the organizational culture, right? Very important as you go into an organization and you are a new project manager to talk to more seasoned project managers in that organization to understand what has gone wrong and in which areas previous projects have gone wrong, so that you can immediately apply these lessons learned to your current project and to getting your current project off to a good start, right? So now, how can we identify risks? And there are some tools and techniques that we're going to talk about. One of the identification tools, and I've used that myself, is to get the technical personnel all in one room for an hour. That's very, very expensive. It's worth it in some cases. And to distribute little flashcards or even little sticky pads with sticky notes. Okay, use one sticky note and write risk on it. An area name to it or anything, and then we're going to take that sticky note. We're going to put it on the board, and then repeat that with a couple of cycles, right? So that everybody gets to write down 5 or 7 risks, and then you look at the board. You determine which risk areas everybody has written about, and then you put sticky notes together. And I know this is management by sticky notes, but believe it or not, I mean, Kanban works the same way in some ways, right, with sticky notes. You will be able to pinpoint some risk areas right there that everybody thinks exist. And that can be very, very valuable for your project, especially if you have a large budget that you're working with, right? So some other techniques are the Delphi technique or expert interviews, where experts write down risks that they have encountered in the past, and those could be very senior project managers, very senior technical personnel in your company, right? You, of course, will always want to look at past projects and at lessons learned from past projects if they exist. Your taxonomy that we just talked about. You can SWOT analysis, which is a strengths, weaknesses, opportunities, and threats analysis for your project. You can also use, and this is one of the probably best tools that I've ever encountered, and I've used that myself as well, Ishikawa diagram, named its inventor Ishikawa, of the fishbone diagram. And as you're seeing here, at the bottom of the slide, there's a fish, right? Here's the head, and here are the bones, right? The whole idea is that the effect would be a risk, right? Is really the risk that you're looking at, and you'll want to look at potential sources of why that risk exists, right? And you can look at it in here we have 6 typical categories like schedule, budget, quality, people, process, and technologies. These categories can change based on the industry and or the activity that you're doing, but I always suggest using these guys here. Look at, well, if you're late, for example, with the delivery, what could be a cause for that? Late bugs, for example. Or in terms of quality, we find too many bugs, right? Of people, maybe we don't have enough people, or people are having to work overtime, right? Those kinds of things. And then you can start attacking here the causes, right? It's going to help you avoid, or it's going to help you mitigate this risk, right? So now, as we look at risks, there is a certain grammar that we need to use in order to describe a risk, and we're still in the risk identification stage here. So I think identifying risks means that we need to understand the condition or a trigger, typically if, the if part of a sentence. Then understand what the actual consequence is that goes into the then part of a sentence. It's important the verb may, or the component to our verb phrase, and then want to understand what the cause might be. Remember, risk identification has a lot to do with root cause analysis, because it is upon us to eliminate or to weaken the root cause so we can reduce the probability or reduce the impact of a risk, right? So the part here is very important to our grammar of a risk sentence, right? You'll see here the benefits as well. Let's take a look at an example. Here's our grammar again. If, then, may, because, what. So if project funding allocated by our if clause here, right? Maybe cut. Maybe cut. Because payroll cannot be funded. Okay. The cycle is compressed. Again, for if here. The effects may be migrated into production. And not defects. Test scenarios can be executed. Bad idea. Right? So, and on and so on. Do we now see why it is so important to use the if, then, because syntax? Because syntax allows us to capture the trigger, it allows us to capture the consequence or the impact of risk, and it allows us to take a look at the root cause as well, right? So, as you go through this video, as you look through this video, or as you think about this lecture in a little bit down the road, please just down and think about a couple of risks that are related to your class project, and then write them down in this syntax, this grammar, right? So, move into our risk analysis and assessment, right? For analysis and assessment, we can start with qualitative risk analysis and assessment. In fact, that's what most organizations do. Some organizations never progress towards quantitative risk assessment. That's okay. Qualitative risk assessment is the minimum, right? So we do qualitative risk assessment. Most organizations use a scale from 1 to 5, which is what you see here. 3, 4, 5, right? 5 categories. They describe with here the probability categories here of remote, unlikely, even chance, highly likely, and near certain. And there's a description and a definition of what would have to happen for a risk to be assigned this probability category. The same applies to impact, because remember, a risk is a risk by multiplying its probability with its impact, right? So the impact categories are typically also 5. We have low, minor, moderate, significant, and high. And these impact categories are very often also defined. Here we see definitions in terms of technical, schedule, and budget aspects. And that's for each of these categories. So then, it's important to understand what our organization's definition of probability and impact is. And for that, remember those 2 risks that I asked you to think about in the risk that you that we just revisited a couple of slides ago, right? Think about what the definition would be, what your definition would be for high probability, likely, probability, even chance, unlikely, and low, and same for the impact, what your definition would be for high, significant, medium, minor, and low impact, right? So, and then if you have your definitions rated, then think of how these apply to the 2 risks that you've written down, right? Do that because we like, or organizations like to plot risks on what is called a risk matrix. That's what you're seeing here, right? Risk matrices are typically typically defined by probability and impact, which one's on the x-axis and which one's on the y-axis. Matter is that risks here, like my risk A here, as you can see, has a minor impact and is a likely probability here. My risk B has a high impact and a high probability. C has a major impact and has a near certainty probability. So why is that important? Because it shows us where we can direct our resources that really don't have much money left for, in addition to just continuing with our regular project to actually manage risks, right? We look at how close a risk is to the upper hand corner in our risk assessment matrix or in our risk matrix. The higher and the closer it is to our upper right hand corner, the more of a priority it has for mitigating, right? Some organizations, most in fact, assign colors to the areas that they consider high priority for mitigation. That's typically red. Here we're seeing a typical organizational risk matrix that starts with if a risk is near certainty, has a major impact, we want to start mitigating, and if a risk is likely but it has a catastrophic impact, we also want to start mitigating. So that is a 3 times a 5 here, and it's a 3 times here, right? So these risks typically have to be addressed. Risks that fall into the yellow area, and again, these areas are defined by company policy. They can be addressed if there's money left over from the red area risks, right? And risks that are in the green area, yeah, start looking at, we probably will want to put those on a watch list, right? And to revisit every once in a while. We probably will not want to develop any risk responses or anything to that just yet, because again, if they're in the green area, they will go on a watch list. So all of this, again, how you deal with risks really depends on the organizational culture, and it also depends on the industry, right? If you write code that is being deployed on a pacemaker that goes into somebody's body and shocks the heart back into regular rhythm, then this red area will be a whole lot larger, because any risks that are anywhere here, even near certainty, but with a minimal impact, you know, we really make sure we don't kill anybody, right? Whereas if you work for, say, a cyber retailer, for example, your red area will be much smaller, right? Because nobody's life is impacted if your equipment or if your software malfunctions. We can also think about risk in a different way and risk assessment in a different way, in which we say, well, so we've got our qualitative risk assessment done now, we've got our little risk matrix, and we have our risks prioritized. We know in the upper right-hand corner or kind of near it, so we know what to do. Now, there's a different way of quantifying risk or of ranking risk, which is really in quantitative dimensions, and very often they overlap with the qualitative dimensions. We say that a high risk costs more money than a low risk, right? Here are different ways of calculating that risk cost, and we'll walk through one of those here, or a couple of those really. We can do a cost-benefit analysis, like, for example, what is the benefit of mitigating a risk to the cost that we have to invest in mitigating it. So the cost of somebody dying versus the cost of revising our code, right? I mean, sure, that this is where the cost-benefit analysis typically is has a pretty good and significant outcome, right? This is where we start with an impact cost, which is the example that I just mentioned, right? And we look at the impact cost either raw, which means it's the cost of impact based on the cost impact of the risk based on a straight impact cost calculation. That is, if the risk occurs, it's going to cost me $1,000, right? We can say we're going to factor that impact cost, and that's much more realistic. The actual cost of the impact might be $1,000, but let's take a look at the probability with which this risk might occur. If the risk occurs only with estimated 50% probability, then that risk is not worth $1,000, it's worth $500, right? We can do the same thing with the response cost, right? We can say, if we do something about the risk, we need to understand what the cost is that we need to invest to respond to the risk, right? It's our mitigation plan cost. But if our mitigation plan for the $1,000 risk would, let's say, cost $750, but the risk probability is still 50%, the factored response cost would be $350 because that is 50% of the $700 that we have calculated as the cost to respond to the risk, right? So I come up with the $750. Looked at the mitigation plan and I estimated the activities in the mitigation plan, right? So there's a rule of thumb here that I want to highlight, which is if the impact cost is higher than response cost, you'll probably want to do something about the risk. However, if it costs more to mitigate a risk than it costs to accept the risk and maybe let it happen, maybe not, I mean, to take a gamble, then we're not going to do anything about the risk, which is what managers don't sleep very well. So here is an overview of the expected monetary value here. The monetary value is another way of calculating risk or of quantifying risk outcomes. And it's a cost, and then you figure out what the consequences could be here, right? And you assign probabilities to the various consequences. The probability will always add up to 100%. They test these consequences, right? And you figure out what the alternative value would be without mitigation of these alternatives here. And then you will want to multiply the outcome of calculation here of this with the estimated probability of that risk cost to actually come true, right? So you can also use the PERT technique of most likely plus least likely plus 4 times most probable divided by 6 in order to calculate the alternative values. There's different ways in which you could do that mathematically. The most important thing is that you always show your math and that you can justify why you're using a certain kind of math, right? Now, the next question is, well, so now we have estimated our risk, we have a risk matrix, we have calculated the factored exposure of our risk, or we have done our EMV calculation, our estimated monetary value calculation. What do you do? Remember, the goal of risk management is, well, once we risks we need to manage, the red one or sometimes the yellow one, we want to figure out what to do or what do we need to do in order to reduce the probability or to reduce the impact. So possible responses here are mitigate, which means we do something, accept, do nothing. We already talked about that. We can also decide, for example, that's what you do every time you sit down in your car and you drive somewhere, you have to have insurance, right? And the insurance will pay for your car and the other car if you have an accident, and for the restoration of the car, for the repair, or for anything else, right? That's called risk transfer. We decide that we are not going to engage in any of the activities that would trigger the root cause to become active, right? And that would be risk avoidance. So, for example, if we were going to walk to the library with our laptop under our arm in the rain in order to research something, we say that, well, if I'm going to run home, take me 20 minutes, so I have a schedule impact of 20 minutes, but I'm going to go get an umbrella, I'm going to mitigate, so I'm going to do something. If I decide that I'm going to be fine, I'm just going to, wing it and walk a little bit faster maybe, and I'm accepting that risk, right? I haven't invested the 20 minutes to go home and get my umbrella, but instead I'm going to say, well, chances. Or at the computer store, when I bought the computer, I put insurance on the computer that would replace my device if it ever breaks or if it gets a short in it. Then I would be very comfortable walking to the library in the rain with my laptop under my arm, because if it breaks, the insurance will pay. Or say, I have my computer, I have a network here, I can just do my research from my home or from the coffee shop in which I currently am. And that way I don't even have to consider going to the library. Now that's risk avoidance, right? The whole idea is whichever possible risk response you pick, not just you, but the team, right, picks, is to reduce the likelihood and reduce the impact. How that? You assign a risk owner, you determine what steps have to be taken to reduce the risk, and you, just like in a regular project schedule that you have built in Microsoft Project now, right? You would assign a completion date to each step and assign reduction expectations to each step, right? So, for example, next month, when I have purchased my umbrella, my risk will go down to, my risk of my computer breaking in the rain will go down to a low likelihood, and the impact of my computer breaking will probably still be serious, right? But that way I would have at least reduced the likelihood, right? And then finally, you will want to ensure that the risk owner gives you regular updates on how the risk mitigation is proceeding. So some project managers decide to track risk mitigation plans as part of their project schedule. And some stakeholders or some project sponsors require that as well, so be prepared. What does risk register look like? Well, our risk register for our class looks like this. Now. So, risks always have a number, condition column, a consequence column, if, then, cause, because, right? And then we have our impact and our probability, and the risk value here, impact, and this is qualitative risk management. As I said, that's more frequent in organizations. And we develop response steps. We ensure that all response steps have a due date, and then we have our owner assigned to this, right? So, going to your next assignment, you have what that I have provided to you with this here entity, and this column is automatically calculated. This is going to help you, right? And the whole idea is that you think about your project, which I asked you to do throughout this lecture already, that you think about what your definition would be of an impact of 5, or an impact of 2, or a probability of 2, or a probability of 3, 4, or 5, right? So, as you figure out how to put an action plan together, assign a due date, and then from your stakeholder list, of course, select a very appropriate risk owner. Here's the vocabulary for this week that I'm expecting you to be conversant in: risk, risk taxonomy, SWOT, fishbone diagram, risk identification, assessment, qualitative, quantitative assessment, risk response, acceptance, transfer, avoidance, fact, expected monetary value, register, risk matrix, probability, likelihood, and impact and severity. All terms I have used throughout this lecture hopefully help you understand risk management as it is defined by PMI in the PMBOK 6. And for in the next session, we're going to talk about project communication, tracking, and reporting, and we'll talk about good status reporting, in which, in fact, we're going to have to report to our sponsor and to our stakeholders, not just our CPI and our SPI and our quality metrics, but also our risks. So for today, are there any questions? Please let me know. In the template provided, there are a few blanks. That's true. Template that's provided is for you to start doing your risk identification. Template should be completely empty. In fact, here is the example, which is what you saw, and here's the template that I'm asking you to use. I'm asking you also to plot your risks here. You will probably have to do that by hand. Any other questions? Welcome, Navina. Are there any questions? Thank you so much for for attending this meeting. Of course, this meeting will be available online.